certainly prisoner of war camps will. In most cases, POW camps were often worse than being shot. Thousands will die of disease and starvation. Imagine the worst place in the world, and then times it by 10. Then you might be close to understanding what Andersonville, along with other POW camps, were like. The facilities were not equipped to handle so many men. It was extremely overcrowded, and a lack of sanitary facilities, like outhouses, and even a lack of water were some of the many issues faced.
Andersonville in the South was considered one of the worst. For many of these men, they simply starved to death, if they weren't fortunate enough to die from a disease. These next images will really give you a clear picture of what prisoners of war really faced.
Here you should have being shot, thousands, and then Andersonville. Now I warn you that before we show you these images, some of them are very disturbing. After the war, Captain Henry Wirtz, Andersonville's superintendent, will be tried and executed for the conditions at Andersonville. Nowadays, there are policies put in place to protect prisoners of war. This includes international wars as well. I'm not saying every country follows them, but they do exist. And yes, this man is really alive. And here, this is the camps at Andersonville. So they stayed in tents. And then, of course, here are all of the dead, all of the grave sites for Andersonville. Moving on to a nicer topic, women support the war. Women played many important roles in the war. This quote is a good representation of a strong Confederate woman supporter. Send me a good musket, rifle, or a double-barrel shotgun. I believe, sir, if a regiment of Yankees were to come, we women would drive them away. Susan Lear of Virginia.
Women took men's jobs at home on the farms and in the factories. They would help make uniforms. They served as nurses, spies, and even some as soldiers. Claire Barton would earn the name Angel of the Battlefield for all her hard work as a Union nurse. She helped establish the American Red Cross that helps out during disasters. During the Civil War, the Red Cross helped to notify families of wounded or lost soldiers.
We've mentioned Dorothea Dix before with the mental health reform. She was placed in charge of all Union nurses. Sojourner Truth is another name you should be familiar with from the abolition and women's reforms. During the Civil War, she worked in hospitals and camps for freed slaves. How wonderful for her to see a direct result of all her protest and work in abolition against slavery. Sally Louisa Tompkins worked for the Confederacy as a nurse as well. So your blanks here should be farms and homes and factories. Down here you should have nurses, spies, and soldiers.
Many African Americans found a job in the Civil War. Many rushed to join the Union Army, although in the beginning, African Americans were not permitted to serve. Once they were allowed to enlist, they came by the thousands. In fact, over 200,000 will fight with the Union. However, they will only be paid half as much as white soldiers.
Before African Americans were allowed to serve as soldiers, they served as spies, scouts, guides, and even grave diggers, as you can see in that top picture. The Navy, for whatever reason, was much more accepting of African Americans. They had been allowed to serve since Revolutionary times. The 54th was probably the most famous and well-known African American regiment to serve in the Civil War. They were the first all-African American regiment to be established. We will actually be watching the movie Glory over these courageous soldiers. I have seen this movie probably 1,000 times now, and I still love it. Can't wait to see it again.
Blanks paid half as much as white soldiers. First all African American regiment, and then spies, scouts, and grave diggers. Weapons and technology. As we mentioned before with medical care, many new weapons and ammunition will have been developed at this time. It makes sense, doesn't it, with the whole Industrial Revolution? Remember, Eli Whitney invented interchangeable parts. This idea helped develop many new guns using many of the same pieces.
Some of these new weapons, like field ordnance rifles, could fire accurately from miles away. We also had our first machine gun, the Gatling gun, that could fire 200 rounds per minute. That's amazing. Bullets had also been improved upon to increase the amount of damage done. These new bullets were cone-shaped and grooved, making them shoot faster out of the barrel and drive deeper into the target. Here you should have targets several miles away and bullets down here. Here, these graphs really give us a perspective of the overall toll of the Civil War. Now, it's important to remember that the word casualty can mean someone who was severely injured as well as someone who died. Look at this graph. Remember we talked about, and like on one of the first slides, if you add up all the other wars that we have served in, we still lost more men in the Civil War.
So more Americans, not overall
Yes,
people dying.
yes, that's important.
But more Americans died in the Civil War than have died in any other war.
And so, and down here, it gives you a breakdown between Union and Confederate. Look at the disease and wounds. How many really died of that? I mean, that's incredible. Going back to that medical care we talked about before.
After the Civil War, Lincoln and Congress created Reconstruction as a process to physically rebuild the South and bring Southern states back into the Union. Congress's first act was to free the slaves. The 13th Amendment will be added to the Constitution and officially end slavery. The 14th Amendment redefines citizenship to include African Americans, and the 15th guarantees all African American men the right to vote. Remember, women will not earn this right to vote until 1920 with the 19th Amendment.
You must memorize these three amendments. 13th, end slavery. 14th, guarantees citizenship. And the 15th, the right to vote.
Okay, your blanks, the top one is Reconstruction. Then here we have 13th, ended slavery. 14th, citizenship. 15th, African American men, the right to vote.
Do you want to pause it? Yeah.
I thought of something for Reconstruction.
Oh.
And we can give it to Pam.
Lincoln wanted a nice, easy process to allow the South back into the United States. He created the 10% plan, which was also called Lincoln's Plan. He discussed the fine points of this plan in his second inaugural address. Basically, he wanted to offer amnesty or forgiveness to all Southern states. The only thing the South had to do was to get 10% of its voters to take an oath of loyalty and to end in slavery.
A very simple process. Unfortunately, everything changed on Friday evening, April 14th, 1865, to be exact. Lincoln decides to celebrate the end of the war with a trip to see a play. Our American Cousin was shown at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. Little did Lincoln know, but an assassination plot was already set into motion as he took his seat in the theater box. John Wilkes Booth was a very popular actor at this time, like Taylor Lautner from the Twilight movies. Everyone loved Booth. Little did they know that he was a die-hard Southerner who saw Lincoln as an ultimate enemy. Booth and his group of friends planned an elaborate plot to take out several key members of the national government.
John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in the back of his head during the play. To escape, he jumped down on the stage, breaking his leg in the process and escaping to a nearby farm. However, he was soon discovered, and fire was set to the barn to drive him out. Eventually, John Wilkes Booth will be shot to death. Now, there are some that would tell you that John Wilkes Booth didn't die that night. Instead, that he fled and eventually came to live in Granbury, Texas. Supposedly, he lived out the rest of his days under an alias and only truly revealed his identity on his deathbed. If you've ever been to the town square in Granbury, then you have seen some references, artwork, and the like about John Wilkes Booth.
Okay, your blanks. See Lincoln's plan, stated in his second inaugural address, 10% of voters, and Lincoln's assassination.
Lincoln will be taken to a hotel across the street where he will eventually succumb to his injuries. Andrew Johnson, his vice president, will be sworn in as the new United States president. Unfortunately, the radical Republicans in Congress decide to take Reconstruction matters into their own hands.
They first divided the South into 5 military districts. Notice the map. Tennessee isn't included. This is because they were the first state to qualify for re-entry under Lincoln's plan. The rest of these southern states are now under martial law. They must obey curfews, and they have many freedoms. Many of their freedoms are restricted. Some of you may remember this from Texas history. These states must now write a new state constitution in which they recognize the 14th Amendment and grant African American men the right to vote.
President Johnson disagreed with many of these actions taken by radical Republicans. Because of this, Congress will attempt to impeach Johnson. To impeach means to bring up on charges. It doesn't mean to remove from office. However, removing someone from office can be a result of impeachment. After someone is impeached, they are put on trial. Now, obviously, Johnson didn't truly do anything wrong, so he wasn't punished. Do you know the name of the only other president to be impeached? No, it's not Nixon. Nixon actually resigned before he was impeached. Bill Clinton was the only other president to be impeached. This was for lying about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky.
No president has ever been removed from office.
Here you should have 5 military districts, state constitutions, the right to vote, and Andrew Johnson.
The government put in place some organizations to help out after Civil War, especially in the South. Freedmen's Bureau was one of these organizations. Their goal was to assist all poor people and African Americans in the South. They helped by distributing food, made sure contracts between former slaves and their employers were fair, and they established schools.
Although many abolitionists moved south to help former slaves, not everyone was excited to free the slaves. Discrimination ran deep throughout the South and even to some northern areas. Many southern states established black codes. Black codes restricted the rights of African Americans in the South. Every African American had to carry around proof that they had a job. They couldn't rent property, they had to abide by curfews, and they couldn't own guns. That's always good, not to own guns around a bunch of people that hate you and threaten you on a regular basis. Again, that was sarcasm, if you couldn't tell. If you broke the rules, you could be forced into labor camps. That sounds familiar. I think most of us know that as slavery.
All right, your blanks. Established to assist all poor people, white and African American. Establish schools. Down there, it's African American rights in the South. Rent property, and then own guns. In addition to all of the regular discrimination African Americans were facing, some states put in place Jim Crow laws. These forced African Americans to use separate bathrooms, water fountains, theater seat sections, separate schools, etc. Some places just flat out didn't allow African Americans. Most of these facilities were of lesser quality as well.
Eventually, in 1896, the Supreme Court will make a ruling about segregation in the case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was a mixed-race individual who decided to sit in the white railroad car instead of the designated colored car. As a result, he was arrested and put on trial. His lawyer argued that the train car for African Americans was a violation of the 13th and 14th Amendments. However, the Supreme Court ruled that if the facilities are of equal quality, separate facilities were legal. So, segregation of races was okay. Now, I'm sure most of you have realized the facilities were not equal. It will not be until the 1960s, nearly 70 years later, that real change will begin to happen. This is my little side note here. I cannot stand discrimination, racism, or any other word you want to use to describe the mistreatments of others because of their beliefs, color of their skin, etc. I cannot believe that still to this day, racism and discrimination still exist. We live in a country of freedom and equality for all, and as Americans, we should all live accordingly.
If what we have just said wasn't enough harassment for African Americans, they faced much more. For instance, many southern states put voting restrictions in place as a way to keep African Americans from fulfilling their 15th Amendment right. The Ku Klux Klan used threats as well as outright physical violence to keep African Americans from voting booths. Poll taxes were put in place knowing that African Americans wouldn't be able to afford and therefore wouldn't receive their ballots. Literacy tests were applied, forcing African Americans to prove that they could read and write. Now, there were plenty of white Southerners who were poor and illiterate. However, they were grandfathered in. This means if your grandfather was allowed to vote without having to pay the poll tax or prove he was literate, then you could be exempted from the tax and literacy test. Does that make sense? This was just simply all loopholes Southerners used to keep African Americans from voting. All right, your blanks. Laws that segregated African Americans from whites. Ferguson ruled separate but equal was legal. Ku Klux Klan and grandfathered in.
And that ends your notes.